If you've ever wondered if George R.R. Martin's initial work on Elden Ring had a major impact on the game's narrative, then look no further than the final boss of Shadow of the Erdtree. Because even if he finished writing the mythos almost a decade ago, his fingerprints are all over the sequence of events that brought us to this rather surprising and controversial conclusion. And for the record, no, I'm not talking about the potential Targaryen behavior going on here. As others have pointed out, you don't necessarily have to interpret the term consort that way, even though that is how it worked for Marika and Godfrey, and Marika and Radahn. But no, that's not where I'm going with this. A frequent topic of discussion in the Elden Ring community is where George R.R. Martin's backstory ends and where the events of Hidetaka Miyazaki's game begins. The consensus, based on multiple interviews with both legendary creators, appears to be that Martin wrote the history of the lands between up to the events of the Shattering, at which point he passed the Elden Throne over to Miyazaki. Ratatoskr did a fantastic job of breaking this down in a recent video, which I'll link below. This, of course, indicates that all of the major players in Elden Ring's divine family, from Marika to Radahn and Ranni, were all initially written by Martin, but after the Shattering, the team at From Software took what he created and ran with it in their own direction. Miyazaki himself has alluded to this, saying that he thinks Martin would be shocked to find out what the demigods, who started out as heroic concepts, have been turned into by the time of the game. But part of the reason I am so intrigued by this topic is that even if Martin finished his work on Elden Ring back in 2016, even if Miyazaki and company have since corrupted the demigods into creatures he wouldn't recognize, if he penned the initial concepts of these characters, then surely his influence must still remain. No doubt the way he described them and the personalities he gave them impacted the path From Software took with them. He might be horrified by the house Miyazaki built, but he still laid the foundation. Take Rykard, for example. If, in Martin's pre-Shattering world, he was a brutal justiciar, then it only makes sense that the mad taint of the broken great runes would turn him down the path of blasphemy. To quote Nietzsche, "Battle not with monsters, lest ye yourself become a monster." After inflicting untold and terrible punishments on Marika's enemies, he became the sacrilegious thing he once sought to destroy. The same can be said of Godric. Of course the run of the Golden Litter runs around grafting limbs and dragons to himself and begging Godfrey to notice him. It's even more appropriate after Shadow of the Erdtree, given the likely connections between grafting and the jarring process. All of this is to say that the founding documents of Elden Ring, even if they were written as far back as the Obama administration, are indeed still impacting the game's narrative in some pretty significant ways. Which brings me to the final boss, Radahn, consort of Miquella. Whether or not I thought this massive plot twist was a wise decision is a discussion for another time. This is an analysis video, not a critique. But the roots of this narrative, I suspect, stem all the way back to Martin's writing, to the way he characterized both Miquella and Radahn. In the words of the great Game Plus The Alchemist, let me explain. According to the remembrance of a god and a lord, dropped by the tandem upon finishing the fight, in their childhood, Miquella saw in Radahn a lord, his strength, his kindness, that stood in stark contrast with their afflicted selves. And so Miquella made his heartfelt wish that Radahn would one day be his king consort. This is probably one of the most loaded item descriptions From Software has ever written. I mean, Marika's tits, it tells us so much in just 2 short paragraphs. We'll get to the Radahn parts in a moment, but first, let's focus exclusively on what this tells us about Miquella. It's easy to forget, especially in comparison to his sister Malenia, who is so visibly suffering from the Scarlet Rot. But Miquella is, above and beyond everything else, a cursed demigod. He was trapped in a state of eternal childhood, a fate that must have wreaked havoc on his psyche. It must have crippled his confidence, knowing that no matter how powerful he might have been, some folks would always view him as just a kid. And based on the remembrance description, it sounds like this was indeed the case. That Miquella really struggled with this curse from a personal perspective. When the remembrance says that Radahn's glory contrasted with Miquella's afflicted self, it suggests that Miquella always viewed himself, despite his talent as a craftsman, despite his good deeds, as a freak. Now, this is obviously a big statement here, so before I go on, I'd like to qualify it further. Based on what I've seen in the community, there's somewhat of a tendency right now to have rather black and white views on Miquella. To some folks, he's a master manipulator who charmed Mohg, Radahn, and even Malenia in pursuit of an age of compassion that would have been built on bones and hypocrisy. Others believe he's a saint who gave up everything to forge a brighter future for the lands between, and wish we'd been given the option to side with him at the end of the game. If you're in either of these two camps, more power to you. All good faith interpretations are welcome here on this channel, and honestly, I think it's great that people have such a diversity of opinions on this character. I'm letting out my inner English teacher here, but that's what good fiction is supposed to do. It's supposed to produce different reactions and interpretations in everyone who engages with it. Personally, I disagree with both Miquella the Manipulator and Miquella the Saint, and instead fall somewhere in the middle in terms of my reading of his character. To me, he's a bit like Daenerys Targaryen, a descendant of a lineage that was responsible for a lot of terrible things, who sets out to right those wrongs and create something better. To break the wheel, if you will. But in pursuit of those admirable aims, ends up repeating the sins of the past, and emulating the very ancestors he sought to distance himself from. Sins like betrayal. I mean, Miquella talks mad shit on Marika for turning on the horn scent, and yet, when we reach the cleansing chamber, Leda, captain of his Kingsguard, cuts a WWE-style promo and challenges us to a steel cage match, even if you've been supporting her zealous rampage up to that point. And at the Divine Gate, where Marika herself might have performed the original sin, he hails us as the champion of the festival. And yes, he is referring to us. That's the title Jaren gives us for defeating Radahn, and then says that our deeds will ever be praised in song. Only for his Elden Lord to windmill spin gravity bomb us into oblivion seconds later. If Mickey the Kid and Big Red had won this standoff, you can bet that they would have made sure that the end of our story didn't make it into the ballads. Oh, Miquella the Kind, tell us whatever happened to the noble Tarnished who sent Radahn's soul to the Shadow Realm and killed the evil Mohg. Well, he left, because his work was done. Now, who'd like a bewitching branch? Just like his mother Marika, who erased or rewrote parts of history that were inconvenient to her reign, like the fact that Godfrey wasn't really the first Elden Lord, this phony promise of a place in history makes me think that Miquella would have done the same. And, of course, I do understand that there are gameplay contrivances here, and that the story had to bend to those needs. But from an analytical perspective, the quickness with which Miquella and his forces turn on our Tarnished is pretty jarring. It's also not lost on me that although he claims to want to help the Horn Scent, Miquella uses the body of an Omen, who have quite a bit in common with the Horn Scent, as a mere tool in his plan to revive Radahn. That's one way of telling everyone that the new boss is going to be a lot like the old boss. I bring this up for the same reason I did Marika's faults in my last video, to make it clear that my reading of Miquella as a tragic figure should not be mistaken for absolution. Still, I think even the Miquella haters out there would have to agree that he does do some objectively good things in Elden Ring, like crafting the needle we can use to subdue the Flame of Frenzy, and trying to help Godwyn die a true death. The Erdtree project clearly didn't work out as planned, but the idea of building a haven for those rejected by the Golden Order is an admirable goal. Now, with all of that in mind, it makes the Remembrance descriptions line about how Radahn's strength and kindness stood in stark contrast with Miquella's afflicted self really stand out to me. He had plenty of reasons not to feel this way, and yet he did. Despite the fact that others would come to describe him as Miquella the Kind, it's clear that he didn't view himself that way, that he viewed himself primarily as a cursed demigod, an afflicted freak. And for all of you Miquella fans out there, I think that this interpretation enriches his character. A demigod who embraces the rejects of society because he can relate to them is much more interesting than a demigod who embraces them for no reason other than that he's just a nice guy. Martin is known to love bastards and broken things, and Miquella is very much a broken thing that became a hero to the metaphorical bastards of the lands between. This, I believe, is why when he founded the Erdtree, he welcomed the meek and the downtrodden, like the Albinorks and the misbegotten. He obviously wasn't an outcast like them. He was a demigod of a powerful and privileged lineage, but he had empathy for them because he knows what it feels like to wish you were born different, to wish you weren't cursed or afflicted. So ultimately, this remembrance is the centerpiece of a reading of Miquella's character that paints him at his core as a deeply insecure person, someone who doesn't like what he sees in the mirror. And from there, so much of what he does in the DLC makes sense. We're talking about a character who literally casts aside body parts and fragments of his own identity on the path to godhood. Primarily, this is about ensuring that his new order has nothing to do with the old, the one that Marika built. But that's also exactly the type of thing someone full of self-loathing would do, which makes his ability to compel affection all the more ironic. Think about that for a moment. The demigod who hates himself, who views himself as an afflicted weirdo, can force other people to like him. Again, if you're looking for George R.R. Martin's influence on this game, it's right here. Because these types of cruel dichotomies, these character-defining contrasts, are all over his writing. Whether it's Jon Snow, who lives his whole life thinking he's a bastard when he is in truth the furthest thing from it, or Jaime Lannister, a member of the Kingsguard who's branded a King's Slayer when he should be hailed as a hero for stopping Aerys Targaryen from nuking King's Landing. He pens stories like this all the time, and I have no doubt that this dark irony was baked into Miquella's character arc right from the beginning. So all his life, despite his overwhelming insecurity, despite how much he loathes himself, Miquella has been able to make anyone and everyone like him. Even after admirable things like curing Freya of the Scarlet Rot, or promising to redeem Hornsent's people and gaining them as followers, I'm sure Miquella had to sit back and wonder, do they really like me? Or are they just drawn to my allure, to my divine appeal? This, in all likelihood, only made him question himself even more. At the end of the day, if you can compel people to like you, does anyone truly, genuinely like you? We know that Miquella breaks his great rune as we approach the Shadowkeep to do away with the original sin, the crimes of his mother. But given how it impacts his followers, I wouldn't be surprised if another reason he did it was because he could no longer deal with this question. Because he couldn't keep asking himself, who among my followers is walking with me willingly? And who's only here because I've compelled them to join me? Which, of course, is a question that the noble General Radahn never had to ask. With how insecure Miquella was, it's no wonder that he was drawn to Radahn. Radahn was everything that Miquella wasn't. Strong, skilled in battle, but most importantly, loved naturally by those who fought under his command. Both the Redmane Soldier set and the Redmane Knight set emphasized that they were warriors who fought at Radahn's side, which seems to suggest that Radahn was always out there with them during battle, an active commander leading his men from the front, like Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, by the way, is a frequent reference point for Martin. In A Song of Ice and Fire's lore, one of the Targaryen kings is Daeron the Young, and he's basically Alexander right down to the conquests and dying at a young age. There are actually a lot of similarities between Radahn and Alexander the Great now that I think about it, which is a topic I'll probably have to explore further down the line here. But back to the knights and the soldiers. Even if that's not the case, and it's just a figure of speech, It's important to note that none of the other knight or soldier sets use this type of phrasing. They all say they were loyal to their patron or served their region, as is the case with Godric's army and Laendel's forces. So no matter how you look at it, the developers seem to be telling us that Radahn inspired a unique devotion in his men. This is reinforced by the Radahn festival itself. The entire reason Jaren is organizing this big bloody going away party is because he's trying to honor an oath he swore to Radahn. As the Eccentric's Hood states, Jaren served General Radahn as a guest commander, and they are said to have sworn an oath of honorable death to one another. And as Jaren says when you visit him after the festival,
"At last, the war festival has ended. Brave champion, you have our gratitude. The celebration was spectacular. General Radahn is surely pleased. Festering with rot and crippled by madness, all he wanted was an honorable death."
This oath, in particular, is really interesting when you compare it with Miquella's vow. But that's yet another discussion for another time. Regardless, this is further proof that those who served under Radahn deeply cared about him and were fiercely loyal to him. He inspired in his men naturally what Miquella could only ever do through the use of his powers. Perhaps, in his naive way, Miquella even believed that with Radahn as his consort, he would never again have to compel anyone to follow him, because the Red Lion would do it for him, either through his crown warranted with strength, or the way he commanded respect. An idea we shattered when we defeated the promised consort and the young Empyrean in front of the Divine Gateway, for we refused to be embraced. Ultimately, I think that's the story From Software is trying to tell here, with this surprising partnership between Radahn and Miquella. That when faced with the prospect of becoming a god, the Empyrean who needed to use charms to compel affection chose an Elden Lord who could inspire it on his own. And if you ask me, that dynamic sounds like some classic George R.R. Martin character writing. I'm sure the vow wasn't a part of what he wrote, but I have no doubt that it's the end result of the personalities and contradictions he worked into these demigods from the very beginning. To be clear, I'm not saying this was always Miyazaki's plan. We know that the base game of Elden Ring underwent significant lore changes right up to release, in some cases even after the damn thing dropped. We know that there were plans for a Miquella ending, which was ultimately cut, and I think that the simple reason why it didn't make it into the game is because Miyazaki realized he had a bigger story to tell with the young Empyrean. The story of an insecure god who sought the perfect consort to make up for his shortcomings, who sought to absolve the sins of the past and forge an age of compassion, but ultimately lost his way and ended up repeating the sins of his ancestors. We can debate forever, and we will, about whether or not this plot twist was a good narrative decision, if Radahn accepted the vow, if he was compelled to do so, or if he turned Miquella down. For the record, I personally still think he broke the vow around the time of the Shattering, and for more nuanced reasons than before, something I plan to go into down the line. But that's just a theory. The more I look at the narrative, the more I am inclined to believe that the path Miyazaki took with these two demigods was the natural result of the way Martin wrote their characters. And that makes Radahn, consort of Miquella, the final boss of Shadow of the Erdtree, the clearest example of George R.R. Martin's enduring influence on Elden Ring. Thanks for watching. Huge thanks to Farewelleon, Moonlapse Piano, and yepeLaugh for allowing me to use their covers from Elden Ring and Game of Thrones for this video. Big shout out to James Pruitt, Corey Matson, Gustavo Balabi, Lil Caesar, Reed, and Pathonian, who get early access to these videos thanks to donations of $5 to $10 a month. See you guys next time.